In this video, we will be covering Rule 9 from Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, with that rule being, if old memories still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. It has been since Rule 5, do not do what you hate, since we've hit a Peterson problem at the zoomed out level, with the Peterson problem being the general observation that, superficially, his advice doesn't sound bad, might even be good and makes sense. But when you start getting into the specifics, it's not good. Maybe it falls apart logically. Maybe his explanation leaves you with more questions than answers. Maybe the implications aren't great. Whatever the reason, the advice ends up being bad, which then leaves a person explaining this looking like a raving lunatic because superficially, the advice is fine. So at the title level, writing down old, troubling, or upsetting memories, presumably in an attempt to process them now, makes sense. More sense on the face of it than working really hard at something and seeing what happens, or beautifying at least one room in your life with an art because reasons. But this is advice from the lobster daddy himself, so things are gonna get weird. Biblically so. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, channel members, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! We are in the final quarter of this Cognitive Psychologist's guided tour of this book, and it is such an exemplar of his whole shtick, I want to dive right in. So we will quickly review what he described this chapter would be from the Overture, take a quick gander at the chapter art and references, and then get to the advice proper. Rounding out this paragraph from the Overture, Peterson says Rule 9 will, quote, make the case that past experiences, whose current recall remains laden with pain and fear, can be stripped of their horror by voluntary verbal exploration and reconsideration. And folks, he is not kidding about the horror. He isn't true. The chaos of life is terrifying form in this chapter. The chapter art has some saint guy getting cuddle bombed by mustachioed demons. Blind stab in the dark. I'd guess Peter because of the beard, but I don't know saints. I'd also guess this ties into the advice in these demons being the painful memories that'll somehow be exorcised by the power of journaling.
This, I believe, was Saint Anthony.
The closest we get to an explanation there is
there's a number of famous representations of Saint Anthony being tormented by demons.
Okay then, we'll just have to figure this out for ourselves. Turns out there's more than one St. Anthony. The one with better search engine optimization was apparently not the one Pearson's talking about. St. Anthony the Great, as opposed to lame ol' from Padua. This particular Anthony was important in making monks a Christian thing early into the faith. Part of his monkliness involved him tripping holy balls in the desert and being tempted, or assaulted, by demons. To mix things up, I asked my Discord what people saw in it, and for the most part, people picked up on the saint and demons angle, but the particulars, no, nobody got, especially St. Anthony. A particular St. Anthony. An amusing number saw Einstein in one of the faces of the demons, and were understandably concerned with where Peterson was going with this advice. Also, given Peterson and or his artist Fogra's willingness to remix or adapt existing versions of art, it's a shame they went with such a tame version of this particular saint, as opposed to one of the more well-known but highly surreal versions. Oh well, this relates to the advice because
we're all tormented by the demons of our imagination, regrets, fears, paranoias.
Peterson highlights the saint's tranquility despite the evil neck muzzle, and Fogra points out that she put Peterson as a saint because he looks up in that way when he thinks. And here is where I would include their elaboration or exploration on any of that, but that's as deep as it went. They must have blown their load on the last chapter's art and are recovering. Fine with me. There seems to be a pretty cohesive story happening between the rule title, overture description, and chapter art so far, that we need to write out memories we're struggling with, lest we be tormented by the rumination demons. So this will continue to be straightforward and cohesive, right?
Captivated by people who can tell a story, who can share their experiences.
Oh, dear viewer, you know better than that. Last of the introductory stuff, as is tradition. Quick refresher of the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book or integrating my thoughts with science. Plus Peterson's references, some of which are indeed peer-reviewed papers. Some. And such restraint. He only cites himself twice. Although while we're here, the first is a Peterson paper in the Journal of Religion and Public Life. Somewhat weird choice for a clinical psychologist, were it anyone other than Peterson, which in text leads into a map as metaphor for your life path. The 2nd through 9th are included in one of his client stories, with the majority being things Peterson gave to the client to read as homework, and the rest having to deal with more repetition on his stories as any and everything thing. My observation of Beyond Order being the reheated leftovers of the original 12 Rules for Life is very true in this chapter. We've heard many stories about Peterson's former clients in 12 Rules, particularly in the rules centered on talking and listening. He seemed to have markedly negative opinions for many, like the client who dared to want a retirement Peterson couldn't see himself tolerating, or the woman who seemed to come to him to help her make sense of an intimate encounter. This led to him sharing his view on the core purpose of memory, quote, to stop the same damn thing from happening over and over. Rituals, myths, and stories have a similar function, containing the wisdom of our ancestors. The Word of God, Logos, is the bringer of order, and it represents learning and growth. We are made in God's image, so our speech can do the same. As such, we need to, Rule 8, tell the truth or at least not lie, to bring about paradise on earth. The truth of things needs to be figured out socially, which is convenient because to Peterson, thinking is just, quote, an internal dialogue between two or more different views of the world. That dialogue can involve someone listening to you, to help you figure out your thoughts. And what is writing if not an externalized dialogue between you and the paper in an attempt to understand yourself? Throw in a greater emphasis on memories and a section on the Bible, and that's basically this chapter. Okay, not exactly. We also get 3 new client stories from people who experienced, quote, near miraculous recoveries thanks to Peterson's therapy. One of whom he just decided to try hypnosis on, despite not having training in doing that. Despite this chapter being about lingering hard or difficult memories, for the most part it stays out of the super heavy memory territory. Mostly. The second section is the exception, and I will remind you when we get there. It's about a woman client who came to Peterson for help processing a sexual experience she had as a child. A huge part of the awfulness in what's written, though, is from Peterson's therapeutic response. If any of that is going to be not good for you, skip that section. And there is no good way to transition off of that, so just moving on. YouTuber call to action. We here at Eris Industries had to replace a good chunk of failing computer hardware this month. So if you like the cut of my cognitive jib and would like to support my future lobster roasting endeavors, you have options. Liking the video and subscribing to the channel, of course, and those are free. You can check out my Fourth Wall store to call out the pedantry and lack of citations in the world, or subscribing and becoming a member of my channel or Patreon. With a note, the Patreon takes less of a cut than YouTube. Just saying. 2 fun facts. First, I'm terrible at these call to actions. Second, if 500 of you joined my Patreon's very affordable $1 baby duck tier, you'd almost double my monthly income, and also help me recover from Ship of Theseusing my beloved Oedipus that much quicker. No pressure. Section 1. But is yesterday finished with you? You did someone dirty, or got done did yourself. Either way, quote, the actual events and the associated memories evoke fear, guilt, and shame. There's a bit of a disconnect for me in this chapter, as someone who has a bit of a neurospice blend, shall we say. Seems to Peterson, these sorts of nagging memories will only occur if a true error happened, and you can remedy this by fixing that error, even if it's just making peace with yourself about it. His causal memory link does explain some of my persistent pop-up memories, sure, but my brain also likes to throw just stupid inane shit I've done at me. Nothing no normal, sane person would take offense to, being afflicted by my awkwardness. And the visceral cringe for those can hit hard. In Peterson's framework, This level of reaction is indicating something profound about how off the mark I was in that moment, but it isn't. Socially awkward penguin is going to socially awkward, as evidenced by me referencing this long dead meme. As long as I'm alive, it's going to continue to happen. I've gotten better at letting this stuff roll off me, but sometimes asshole brain is going to asshole brain, and the cringe memory monsoon happens. Maybe the depth psychologist lobster would say this means I haven't found a true root of the problem yet, so I need to get me to those weekly therapy sessions until I stop being so awkward. Which does guarantee they would have a client until I died, so GG there, I guess. I've included this point here because I think it's something important to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. Peterson says it doesn't really matter if you were on the giving or receiving end of the negative event. Quote, "What does matter is that you do not desire any recurrence. Maybe you were the doer or the doee. Perhaps it was any number of contexts. Doesn't matter to the evolved emotional systems that only want to keep you from repeating mistakes." I wish he'd given us more info on this emotional system, because this cognitive psychologist doesn't have enough info to meaningfully start digging. We were talking about memory in this chapter, but now he's talking about protective emotional systems. There are absolutely strong networks between memory and emotion centers in the brain, but with what he's got here, especially because it's not just negative emotions that impact memory, or with the intent of preventing mistakes. Emotion is such a big topic in cognitive, there's a handful of journals devoted to it. For example, the journal Emotion published a paper in 2019 that found a memory bump from positive emotions. This was for associative word learning, so we are in fundamental basic cognitive land, but better cued recall for positive words nonetheless. Or less abstract, in the 2011 Cognitive and Emotion, Yegi Yan and Yonelinas presented an interesting memory effect that's pretty relevant for this discussion. We can talk about how broad or narrow a memory is. And this is basically how much of the surrounding stuff is getting encoded with the target piece of information. Narrow memory means you've got the target information, not much else. Broad memory means you've got that target piece of information plus the stuff surrounding it. This experiment demonstrated that you can influence the memory width by manipulating the positive or negative arousal. In this case, the memory for information in photographs from a very well-normed database with pictures that are next to impossible to find online because they, by design, want to keep these pictures novel and not something that you see just on the internet. After a single training viewing of the pictures in this experiment, participants were better able to recognize the peripheral information for the positive pictures than for the negative, indicating that they had a broader memory for those positive pictures. Peterson's emotional memory systems throwing memories at you only so you don't repeat mistakes doesn't quite gel with these findings. The way he writes about memories, it's like you'll only be getting negative memories bobbing back up into awareness. Maybe he's only intending this chapter and advice to be for negative memories, but if that is the case, there is a gaping hole in his writing about positive or even neutral memories. Those evolved systems employ terror and use it to indicate you done fucked up but haven't yet learned not to do it again.
Learn from the past, or repeat its horror and imagination endlessly.
He talks about this terror memory system as if it's a logical operator that'll drop these negative memories as soon as you've learned your lesson, which, no. Add in his emphasis on terror and horror, and it sounds like he's actually talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, rather than run-of-the-mill negative memories, and that is a huge can of worms. One we'll address by continuing on with this section. Peterson says people frequently try not to think about bad things that have happened, with it sometimes reaching a point where they can't even understand the event, with a notable lack of endnotes. However, it doesn't matter if the not thinking is by choice or not. The person will not be able to move on from that memory until they've fully processed it, with the implication that once you have, the memory will forever be put to bed. Reference 1 is to this thing from Peterson and a colleague. At first glance, it looks like it's from a journal called Religion and Public Life, and it's reasonable to assume that because it fits the general journal format. But it's not. Oh, what is it with these people and things having to be so incredibly complicated? Rhetorical question, but real answer. Cynically, it's so they can say fucking bullshit with the appearance of it being commonly accepted when it's anything but. Uncovering this whole thing was practically an accident. because I generally prefer the way journal articles are when finalized, not the preprint version. I was only able to find the in-press version through Google Scholar, so turned to my trusty library hookup to try and hunt down this religion and public life journal, but wasn't turning up anything.
That's suspicious.
This wouldn't be the first time this happened, so the next step is a general Googling to try to find this journal on the publisher's website, and lo and behold, it's not a peer-reviewed journal at all, but an odd book series.
That's weird.
Religion and Public Life is the series subtitle. That 33 that made me think this was a regularly published journal is actually the volume of this book. And weirdly, the volume Peterson's paper appears in, number 33, is from all the way back in 2003, not 2017 as he has it here and on his website. If we look at the in-press version again, it conveniently doesn't include the year. Just to see if this was a weird Peterson thing, I checked the other author, and she also has it as 2017. Despite there being references to this work prior to when it was supposedly published. A big red flag for me here is that the academic rigor bar is substantially lower for books. To get something into a book, you just have to get it past the editor, and if you're friends with them, easy. As opposed to this article being picked apart by a bunch of blind peer reviewers looking for faults before it can be published in a journal. I skimmed it, and we're not really going to go through it, because to this cognitive psychologist, the branch of psychology that has a pretty big emphasis on memory, it's garbage. Let me tell you how I reached that conclusion. For starters, there's a brief aside to cognitive, with the data showing memory is not a perfect representation of the past. Beyond that, it's off to Peterson's depth psychology-inspired model of memory, basic cognitive or neuropsych be damned. This is in keeping with the book's vibe, though. From the book's summary, quote, "Memory is not a mere repository for past events. This was Henri Bergson's fundamental claim about consciousness, in distinguishing our psychic constitution by its sense of the past, blah, skipping down, blah, quote, the contributors explore the manner in which cultural and psychic violation undermine collective identity and destroy traditions." Peterson's right at home here. What should be valid empirically based models of memory? Not so much. The really annoying part for me here is we do know a lot about trauma and memory. Maybe not everything, but enough to not have to be dredging up Freud to explain things. I generally default to what amounts to a materialist perspective on things. My primary focus is what's going on in the brain. In PTSD, so on the extreme end of responses to bad events, a neural fear network seems to form after the traumatic event happens. There's a fair bit of variability in who will develop PTSD, with some of it coming down to genetics and traumatic load, plus the person's general resilience. But we're not at a point where we can directly know what people's felt experiences are of things based on their head jello activity. And things get drastically more complicated with the multitude of theories for PTSD. Peterson's perspective seems to be a mishmash of Freud's PTSD flashbacks as the unconscious wanting to get psychological meaning for the traumatic event, Genet's assimilation and digestion, and Janaf Bullman's social cognitive theory of shattered assumptions, wherein the person's understanding of the world is catastrophically challenged. Given my background, it's probably unsurprising, but I gravitate more towards an explanation that emphasizes the feedback loop that forms in the wake of the traumatic event, with the treatment focus being on disrupting that feedback loop, as opposed to trying to pull out the event's meaning to appease the unconscious mind or update the person's schemas of the world. So all of that was a very long way to say that while Peterson's reference there might be highly sus, his view isn't without theoretical grounding. It's just pulling from and will be informed by the depth psychologists, and as such will only have glancing brushes with neuroscience. With the theoretical groundwork laid for this chapter, we're going to shift into a faster pace for a bit. I'm warning you because it's going to be a lot of text with a lot of distilling. I'm talking like 190 proof Everclear levels of distillation. Following a physical space metaphor for your memories, understood or not, you need to know where you have been, currently are, and are going. Metaphorically.
Never get lost.
I'm not entirely sure how the successes and obstacles, what will become failures in a sec, fit into the map metaphor. I'm going to move forward with the idea they'd be sort of like the little blips on the SNES Super Mario World map, but I might be going too literal here. Yay successes! Boo failures! The latter of which somehow, quote, indicate our profound ignorance. That further shows our map is poorly understood?
The forward azimuth going in this direction, but we need to come back the other way. So we add 110 to 180 because 180 is the opposite direction.
I think it's a prank.
I don't understand how obstacles on a map of life automatically indicate any of this. Maybe it's because I can't really understand Peterson's two-box mode of thought because these failures, if I'm even understanding what's intended there, aren't necessarily anxiety-provoking, depressing, and painful to me, which, believe you me, I'm on the faster end of getting anxious and or depressed. In line with the psychodynamic views of PTSD I mentioned earlier, Peterson says we have to figure out the, quote, moral from experiences. Otherwise, doom. Although this is a spot where the lack of clarity on just how negative he's intending the past experiences to be is a distinct problem. The present person being so lost as to not have the spark to put themselves back together is really fucking bleak. But that part is following how, quote, we must rekindle every lost opportunity. Every single one? That's no small task because we are clumsy beings. And honestly, I don't see how me forgetting to take the trash out last week is sending me one step closer to hell. When you're a kid, your metaphorical map is pretty basic, just like a kid's drawing of a house. Most everyone can understand it's a house, even if it's super stripped down. But houses can contain horrors. Horrors that might be beyond comprehension. But how incomprehensible horror? Because the body can understand what the mind cannot, but will demand understanding or else doom. This is part of why I front-loaded the PTSD discussion, so we could look at this and see its roots. That he's working from the assumption that if you don't adequately process some bad event, it's going to fester in the depths, gnawing at you. That you must assimilate and digest it in order to have the associated memories leave you alone. But as comically highlighted, this is basically just Peterson's opinion. An opinion that informs how he does therapy with his clients. Section 2. Do not fall twice into the same pit. This is a section I mentioned earlier, the one you might want to skip if childhood abuse is a tender spot for you. The next section will pick up at the timestamp on screen, and the chapter will also work. Before we get to this client's story, I should remind you of some features of Peterson's therapeutic approach that he talked about in the original 12 Rules, Rule 9. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. He thinks it useful and important for his clients to get his reactions to what they're saying. This may involve whatever thought or, quote, fantasy flits through his mind as a reaction to what the client is saying. Quote, we discuss it. We try to determine the relevance of meaning of my reaction. Sometimes, perhaps, it's about me, but sometimes it is actually useful for the other person, according to him. I don't know how much I'd care for that approach personally, but then again, I'm not exactly signing up for psychodynamic therapists, so your mileage may vary. I'm going to massively summarize this section. Early into therapy with a particular client, they were talking about sexual abuse that happened to her when she was 4. He describes letting his imagination, quote, roam freely with many assumptions about the, quote, sadistic nature of her attacker from what she was saying. With his imagined scene in place, he asked her for the age of her, quote, victimizer, and it was her 6-year-old cousin, so he was 2 years older than her. So then Peterson told her about what he'd imagined based on her description to illustrate how out of proportion he felt it was in her memory. Then he told her what's on screen, that he isn't trying to minimize things, but they were playing doctor as curious, unsupervised kids do, and it went too far. I've never experienced this sort of thing at any point, so I can only imagine how hearing this from a therapist would feel, especially after being told what he had imagined of the attack. I don't know, but I don't think I could receive it as anything but minimizing. Peterson says her memories of the experiences, maybe indicating this wasn't a one-off event, had stayed fixed in how it felt to her as a child. He helped her update them as an adult, which essentially cured her within that session. Here is the place I must remind you I'm not that kind of psychologist. I have zero training in what the best practices are for helping someone like this client. The best I can do is look for resources from bodies like the American Psychological Association or other articles and go from there. In my understanding, It seems like a common element between the different philosophical approaches is to help the person regain a sense of control. Another aspect is helping the person contextualize what happened in the broader narrative of their life. Perhaps what Peterson did with his client could be considered that, bringing her understanding of the nature of her cousin at that point in his life into an adult perspective. But I don't know. That said, I want to point out that Peterson doesn't provide much in the way of specifics. I'm not wanting the full details the client shared with him, absolutely not. But it's not clear how long this went on for, and besides the strong emotional reaction she had in telling him the story, it's not clear how much this was impacting her life. Like, is this something that's relatively compartmentalized, but when she digs into it, it's distressing? Or is it having a broader impact on things like her relationships? Because if this was something she'd been carrying and needed help processing, but was otherwise okay, her being able to reframe it and get over it in one session makes sense. If it was a bigger problem for her than that, as a layperson in this space, it seems unlikely that she'd be done and dusted with it that easily. Like, maybe she'd feel okay with it at the end of the session, but then later, mentally chewing on it some more, some ground might get lost. Basically, trauma can be really hard to work through, and I'm suspicious of claims of a quick fix. Peterson closes out the section on the, quote, philosophical quandary that resulted on what is the most true memory. I feel like this is something I wrestled with and came to a personally satisfactory answer in high school from one of the books we read. Must have been either The Good Earth or Things Fall Apart. Probably the latter. The way I settled this is you have an event happen, and if everything was being filmed 24/7, you would have a relatively objective perspective of that event. Failing that reality TV nightmare existence, once the event is over, even while it's happening, the objective version of that event is gone forever. So even while the event's happening, people will have their own version of it, and differences between people will continue into the future. Some people might have a relatively faithful memory of the event. Some people's memory will drift over time. And even with a more true version or memory of the event, the context the event's placed in or the meaning of the event may change. So to answer Peterson's question, I'd guess I say that all her memories were real. It may have been recontextualized from the therapy session, but that doesn't make her previous memory of the event or events any less real. But I guess he might be succumbing to the two-box compulsion here, with only one version of his client's memory getting to occupy the real box, even if the truth of the matter doesn't just have to be those two categories. Section 3. Possessed by Ghosts. The third section also contains a client's story, albeit much longer and more detailed, and I'm also going to summarize. This client was a young gay black man who'd been brought to Peterson by his aunt after he'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia by a quite possibly rushed hospital psychiatrist. There is a sizable footnote warning readers to be very careful and judicious in what information is shared and how when seeking mental health help, especially in areas where the resources are stretched thin. There is a chance, a non-zero chance, that a turn of phrase or even a symptom might be incorrectly understood and spun up into a broader diagnosis that isn't appropriate. And so people need to be careful with what they say and how they say it. I agree with what he's saying here. We talked about it in the psychological disorders video, whichever corner, and I even have some personal experience with it. Up until more recently, the only psychological disorder that had self-harm in any capacity was borderline personality disorder. To some practitioners, including the worst psychiatrist I've ever had the displeasure of interacting with, if you said you'd ever engaged in that, despite having none of the other characteristics or diagnostic features, that was the diagnosis. And as Peterson said, once a diagnosis is in your medical records, it's nigh on impossible to get it removed. Once it's there, it's basically there for good. Although, impractical life hack, moving countries and medical systems is a way around that. Peterson thinks his client's schizophrenia diagnosis came from him saying that he accepted his parents' belief that he was possessed by demons. His parents were very controlling of him as a kid and were, quote, uneducated to a marked degree, very superstitious and religious, and apparently serious in the belief that spirits inhabited their son. Peterson says his parents believed him to be possessed because of the particular difficulty he was having in sleeping, with his body contorting over and over again while trying to fall asleep. This started roughly 4 years prior, along with some depression and anxiety after the breakup with his live-in boyfriend. Maybe I'm just going off of stereotypes here, but the interaction between the parents' religiosity and the client's sexuality isn't mentioned. Pearson also describes him as young, but having been old enough to have graduated college and be 4 years post live-in breakup. So by my estimate, I would guess that puts him in his mid-20s at the youngest. His parents know enough about his sleeping habits to consider him possessed, which I'm not sure if that means he's back living with them or he's told them about it. In either event, I'm left wondering if their view of his being possessed was only from the sleep disturbances. You know? And also if there were some interactions happening with his parents that was just making everything worse. We can work through some of the references for this chapter as Peterson details the diagnoses he tested. First up was sleep paralysis, even though the reason why that seems like a bad fit is in the name. If you're not familiar, sleep paralysis occurs when the typical physical paralysis of sleep persists after you wake up. I've experienced this. It sucks. You don't have to be fully conscious when this happens either. You can have some awareness of your surroundings and immobility, but still have lingering weirdness from the dream. As per Peterson's third and fourth references, this is probably where people's alien abduction experiences comes from. One sleep paralysis incident involved a UFO zooming in to abduct me and starting the process, waking up out of fear, but still being paralyzed and hearing my pulse just super loud. And thankfully I knew about the phenomenon, so it was just willing my body to catch up with the program, and eventually it did, but whew, scary shit. Pearson gave the client reference 5 to read, which he did, but felt it didn't really describe his experience. And whoever's responsible for editing this book missed a weird gender typo, putting her instead of his. Treatment progressed, and eventually the client told Peterson more about the final fight with his ex. It started while they were out, continued when they got back to their place, and escalated into a physical altercation. And that was it for them. This fight was extra hard for the client because he didn't believe people were capable of violence. The client's degree was in history, so Peterson found this hard to believe. But eventually the client shared that his parents raised him to believe people were only good, and he wholeheartedly believed it. Peterson felt he had to break his client of his naivete, so in the session, they talked about the horrors of the 20th century at length, and when that wasn't enough, Peterson assigned him references 6 and 7 as homework. While that made the client wiser and sadder, it didn't fix the sleep trouble. Okay, so these reading homework assignments feels a bit weird, especially the content of them, but some of the psychodynamic PTSD approaches include needing to update the person's schemas or understanding of the world if they also have these everyone is good beliefs, so Peterson's not entirely pulling this out of his ass. Peterson then thought this client might have a somatization disorder. Okay, he says somatization, but I think he actually means conversion disorder. Somatization disorder is tied up in the person being too keyed into their bodily sensations, feeling normal things as abnormal, and an obsession over their symptoms. Like, a person with diagnosed chronic health problems can have this on top of that, so it's going beyond the normal level of concern for these things. Conversion disorder is where psychological problems manifest as physical symptoms. As an example, from my undergrad days, a fellow student who herself was a bio major was returning from a medical leave because she'd been functionally blind for a year. They did all the tests, and there wasn't a physical reason for her blindness, so it was apparently from stress. And it resolved after taking that year off, de-stressing, and finding the right psychiatric meds. I would think conversion disorder would be a better fit, especially since his working hypothesis is that these bodily contortions are a result of some unresolved psychological problems. Pearson's next hypothesis was whichever somatoform disorder he actually meant, because the previous tested hypotheses were wrong, and the client's symptoms did start after the last fight with his ex. So the thing to do, apparently, is try hypnosis. Even though Peterson doesn't have experience or training with it, It was good enough for Freud. Don't worry, it's totally okay, you guys. He already led clients in guided relaxation. Hypnosis is kind of the same thing. The quibble I have here is it sounds like guided relaxation would be something useful and important to teach to clients who are having trouble with agitation, anxiety, and insomnia, so they could do it themselves outside these appointments, rather than him just leading them in it in the office setting. Reference 9 is dropped in to support the claim that there's substantial variability in therapeutic hypnosis efficacy. That is talked about in this 1978 book, Trance and Treatment, but it's not the focus. This was written by at least one psychiatrist. The lead author does most of the talking, not sure about the other author's background. After, he got super into hypnosis, in part because of Freud. The primary focus of the book seems to be on a test they created to assess the hypnotizability of patients, because of the variability between people, as well as potential therapeutic applications of hypnosis. I'm skeptical about the bigger hypnotic claims, especially given the wild inconsistency and replicability. But there is an interesting note early into this book about people who are highly hypnotizable. Basically, they'll just hypnotize themselves. The hypnotist just needs to stay out of their way.
Sometimes foreshadowing is...
I will say, this whole book is wild. It's on the Internet Archive, so check it out if you'd like. We are continuing on. Pearson told the client his hypnotic intent and obtained consent. It's unclear if he was upfront about how uncommon this was for him to do. Things are going to go slightly sideways, but something I'm not sure about is Peterson's time management. From the little bit I know, having quickly read through Reference 9, this is something that should have been built up in a couple weeks prior to the actual hypnosis session, not something that was started halfway through a session. Peterson started the guided relaxation process, emphasizing the client's breath and attention to his body, when the guy seems to have hypnotized himself.
relatively obvious.
The client once again tells Peterson about the final fight with his ex, but in much more vivid detail. This feels very theatrical, which is probably fitting for a hypnotic session with Jorperson. Sidebar: if you'd like me to go into the research on hypnosis, drop a comment. The client seems to have initiated the shoving, but the ex was able to get him onto the ground and menaced him with a lamp. The important part seems to have been the look his ex gave him, but as I alluded to, Peterson doesn't have time for that, the hour's up. Too bad the client's not interested in that. This strikes me as incredibly irresponsible and unprofessional. It's like he suggested doing it on a whim, but hadn't really thought things through or considered some important shit, like doing the prep work to make sure he was prepared for whatever came up, and making sure they'd have the full session, if not maybe booking 2, so they'd have time to deal with whatever came up and do some debriefing, aftercare, just making sure he's in a good-ish spot before sending him off. We know Peterson to be a lot of things, but this just seems so reckless, and I'm not super on board the hypnotherapy train. To do this so haphazardly while believing it's a powerful tool in helping people deal with trauma, then telling others about it in a life advice book. Peterson was worried and unsure what to do, but hey, this was his last client of the day, so let him finish, then send him out. The client reiterated the look his ex gave him, the ill will behind it, and the ramifications for his worldview. The client was deeply emotionally affected by recounting this story, but concluded it with him getting away to his mom's place. He's tried not to think about it since, but the feeling that his ex might have willingly killed him clearly shook him. So, my friend Lily, whose relationship story I shared in a video a couple years ago, one of the things that lingered for her was the look her ex would sometimes give her, especially if he wasn't getting his way. She described it as pure hatred, and having that come from the person you thought was your nearest and dearest, yeah, that would really mess with you. I could see wanting to avoid fully processing it as his client had, but that's going to be hard to just shake off. The client has concluded his story and is probably in a not great emotional place. Do you think Peterson's going to spend some extra time now, trying to get the client back into a calmer and more okay headspace? Other than making sure the client wouldn't be home alone? No. Peterson's sending him home with plenty of lofty words for the reader about the, quote, inarticulate elements of his client's being, insisting he learn that people aren't angels. This comment about the sleeping body position duplicating the defensive bodily movements. Peterson assumes it's the unconscious echoing what happened in the fight, and I suppose that could be true, but I will offer an alternative. That being the position most people, I think, would end up in if they're carrying a lot of stress and tension. A lot to end up fully curled, but I was definitely there during my dissertation. However, as mentioned with the theoretical approaches to treating PTSD, Peterson's emphasis on the client's belief in the utter goodness of people being shattered and needing to reconcile that is consistent with the psychodynamic depth perspectives.
The next week, my client did not show up for his session. I thought, oh god, maybe I did him some serious damage.
Peterson gives no indication of trying to reach out to the client to see how he's doing or anything, just, oh no! Oh well. The client was back the week after, though, saying that he'd been too rattled to attend the week prior because the day after the hypnosis session, he saw his ex in a restaurant, something Peterson calls, quote, an uncanny coincidence. Jung came up with the concept of synchronicity, which is a thing where two unrelated events are interpreted as being related. A meaningful coincidence, you might say. And maybe they are unrelated, but maybe they are related, even if it's just in what your unconscious mind is trying to bring up into your conscious awareness. But maybe they are related, metaphysically. Confirmation bias or other heuristics at best, pseudoscience at worst. A couple days later, and the client had calmed down, and the convulsions were briefer and less frequent. Peterson asked him what he thought had changed, and the client again emphasized the look his ex gave him and finally being able to understand it. Okay, so we've got a client who was eminently hypnotizable, which means that hypnotherapy is more likely to be effective, and I fully acknowledge that hindsight is 20/20. But if the symptoms started after the fight with the ex, and the client has some knowledge or awareness that something in that fight was important, seems like the thing to do would be to focus in on what happened that night and in that fight, rather than engaging in a somewhat dubious practice that the practitioner isn't really proficient in, particularly if the patient is just promptly sent off without proper aftercare. But Peterson's gotten a taste for it, so he wants to hypnotize the client again to, quote, make sure that we got everything. This time the story was much faster, which satisfied Peterson that the moral of the event had been found. Because again, this is an emphasis for the psychodynamic PTSD approaches. This superposition between trauma and more low-key problems is really bugging me in this chapter. Journaling about old upsetting memories is a bit different than trying to DIY trauma therapy, and it seems like this sort of advice book should be focusing on the former, but these stories have been the latter. No matter, this client was cured. His map was now more complete, so he'd be able to navigate the world safely. I can't emphasize it enough that I'm not a therapist, but from what Peterson's written, it seems like this client hadn't fully processed the look from his ex and how it made him feel. He was avoiding thinking about it, quite possibly at the cost of his mental and physical health. I know Peterson has to frame it this way, with the grand narratives and all, but I'm left wondering how many creative liberties have been taken with this client's story to make it a better story with a clear lesson. Did this client have this clear-cut, cured experience after those 2 hypnosis sessions with all of the symptoms, so the sleep problems, depression, and anxiety, all abating? Or was the road to recovery perhaps a bit more rocky? Especially if he felt that he was out of the woods enough to not have to keep going back to therapy, but continue to work on himself alone. Was it purely about the client's refusal to accept that people aren't the angels he'd been raised to believe, as is Peterson's emphasis? What family dynamics were impacting things in the background? Again, his parents were described as very religious, superstitious, and uneducated. His aunt is the one interfacing with Peterson. The client is gay. It seems vanishingly rare for people of those descriptors to be accepting of LGBTQ kids. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this client's story that we're just not hearing. Section 4. Uncomprehended Malevolence. Finally, the last of the client stories for this chapter. Although this is where we get the Peterson paid website pitch, so temper your expectations accordingly. This client was of college age, but seems to have been bullied out of it. When he saw Peterson, he wasn't really verbal, was on antipsychotics, and from the behaviors and associated visuals, Peterson took it all to mean, quote, he was in a world of his own. No. Something about the combo of antipsychotic medication and a manipulable visual hallucination I might be inclined to think that signified something like schizophrenia, but maybe that's just me. Okay, so the quick version of this guy's story. A nice girl developed a crush on him. He turned her down, so she went nuclear and got their classmates to bully him. Whatever friends he'd made started to avoid him and distance themselves from him to avoid being caught in the crossfire. Peterson wanted to know the roots of his client's vulnerability going all the way back, so used the past authoring program at selfauthoring.com. If you too would like to author yourself, check out the details of some guy at U of T Austin who has thoroughly researched this invaluable tool in this footnote, and make sure you check out the website where you too can blah blah blah. We really dug into this site when he footnote promoted it in Rule 1. Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement, where he had foisted it on a client then too. Basically, this past authoring is $14.95 and has you write about your life in a structured way. The same 3 research links are provided on the website today as when we covered it before. The too long didn't watch summary of those hype papers are that the results are, quoting an independent test of this tool, spurious, at least when tested in large-scale undergrad student populations to help academic performance or retention, as seems to be Peterson's main use of it, because there's a lot of money to be made there. Okay, so this tool, not meaning Peterson, has a client write out his autobiography in distinct chunks, then pull out important events from each chunk and write the consequences those have had. This will, quote, update his autobiographical map. A weird thing I stumbled on is that Peterson's website seems like a less trauma-focused version of a pre-existing tool called narrative exposure therapy, something that predates the self-authoring by at least a decade, but it's got the same idea. Have the person make the, quote, chronological narrative of their life, concentrating mainly on their traumatic experiences, but also incorporating some positive events, with the intent being to help contextualize the traumatic parts into the person's broader life story. The hope is that this process helps the person place the trauma in a smaller piece of the full story. It happened, yes, but it isn't what defines them. It also includes interactions with a therapist, as opposed to the rather sterile and self-directed self-authoring website. The client did all this writing, and Peterson learned that he was also very naive and believed, quote, that people were universally good. So Peterson helped him understand the nice girl's motivations and also how to defend himself against her actions. As a client wrote about his recent month, month? This was all inside of a month? At the outset of the story, Peterson said this happened in this guy's first year of college, but now he's saying it happened within a month. And I'm twigging onto this because there's schizophrenia and schizophrenia, with different long-term prognoses for these. So there's the schizophrenia you're probably familiar with. Once it sets in, the person will almost certainly need treatment for life, commonly powerful antipsychotics. They may experience hallucinations, delusions, flat or blunted affect, catatonic behavior, and so on. Then there's schizophreniform disorder. It's kind of like schizophrenia, but will be over inside of 6 months. A combination of genetic predisposition and environmental stress, like say, a bully at school trying to ruin your life, seem to be needed for either to develop, and I don't think it's understood why some people will develop the much, much rarer, shorter version. Medication, plus treatment to help with coping skills and problem solving are important in helping the person get back to their old selves. Peterson helped the client better understand his current problem and what he could do to solve it and cope with it in the future. The client initially presented with visual hallucinations, mild aphasia, so reduced speech, and unusual movements, at a point where the already stressful first year of college got the extra stress of an extreme bully. To me, this doesn't seem like a near miraculous recovery, so much as a schizophreniform disorder on the recovery. Yes, Peterson's writing thing may have helped the client do the self-work that's important for the recovery process, especially for contextualizing the pain from the nice girl bomb going off. It's almost like Peterson selling his role as therapist short here to emphasize the map metaphor, because what might have been more critical for this client is learning the tools to cope with this, to deal with this, to problem solve in the future. Also, only saying this because of Peterson's personal track record, I am really hoping a responsible psychiatrist was in charge of this client's medication, and that he wasn't just yanked off the antipsychotics because of this near miraculous recovery. Section 5. Potential into actuality. this section seems to be trying to reach profundity through sheer loquacious force. So, a long deepity. We're gonna speedrun it. People may worry about the future and can get stuck in choice paralysis. It can be hard to break out of the choice paralysis and commit to choosing. Choosing solidifies what you picked into capital B being. Your ethics inform your choices, so choose well. We intuitively understand this, as our consciences will let us know when we missed the mark. Although, to break the gisting rhythm for a sec, I don't think the, quote, pangs of conscience that roll in while I'm trying to fall asleep are necessarily from sins of omission or commission, as you call them in 12 Rules. Socially awkward, going to awkward socially, then brain reminds ad nauseum. Doesn't make it evil. Choose and do what is right, lest you be judged as you would judge others. Plus, in accidental Marxism moment, saying people, quote, should justly receive the fruit of their honest and voluntary labor. Privyet, comrade! And finally, we're all rolling through life making choices, so respect people. Yeah, so, it can be hard to nail down a choice sometimes, but it's important to do so. Try to make good choices, in part because your conscience will torture you for your evils, but also to keep up with the ethical Joneses and treat others with respect. In many, many, many more words. Section 6. The Word as Savior. And if it wasn't clear from the section's title, it's Bible time in this final section. You being a choosing agent is, quote, encapsulated and represented in stories because what isn't? These stories are the collected wisdom of our ancestors, which give detail to the life maps. This is such a long and roundabout way to set up why the Bible stuff he's going to be throwing at us is important, even though this is something that's happened nearly every chapter. The thing he's probably never going to be able to sell me on is why I should think these stories, largely collected almost 2 millennia ago, have relevance for most of the things I'm dealing with at present. Especially when we get out into the specifics. I am in a dual PhD relationship, have ended up the trailing spouse, and I'm a YouTuber. The things still on my plate are dealing with the chronic health stuff and growing my channel. What saith the Bible? Submit to my husband and be a multiplicative fruit? Nah, dog. Pass. I'm not unhappy with my life. Those are just my aims at the moment. I don't need somebody telling me that there's stories in the Bible that'll help me live my life better. I'm good, brah. The kitty chewing on my cable, though. Furthermore, I'm not sure how useful the Bible is for most people with the general things they're going through, short of the massive Jungian ass pulls Peterson likes to do. You can do those sorts of interpretations and get all sorts of meanings out of anything, as Peterson's quite helpfully demonstrated every time Harry Potter gets thrown in the mix.
It is for such reasons we are so captivated by people who can tell a story, who can share their experiences concisely and precisely, and who get to the point.
This chapter is far from be precise in your speech.
That point, the moral of the story, is what they learned about who and where they were or are, and where they are going and why. Such information is irresistible to us all.
We value stories with broad meanings, particularly if they touch on the hero transforming chaos into order thing Peterson adores. Reference 10 is Maps of Meaning, and reference 11 is a book by Mircea Eliade. That name might be familiar, as Pearson brought him up in the story-heavy Rule 2. Imagine who you could be, and then aim single-mindedly at that. At that point, frustratingly but amusingly without a reference, even though Peterson was dropping him in as having described the single monotheistic god rising from many sub-gods. I was initially going to let the scholar slide without comment, but my Discord had some choice words about him, and I'd never heard of him, so briefly. Eliade was a Romanian religious historian, active in the last century. The big thing associated with him was the idea of eternal return. That, quoting Wikipedia because my brain is fully in chickens on the moon mode, myths and rituals do not simply commemorate hierophanies, or a manifestation of the sacred, but, at least to the minds of the religious, actually participate in them. He has some theoretical overlap with Jung's collective unconscious and Joseph Campbell's monomyth. Eliade's work is not without criticism, as he tended to overgeneralize to make mythic examples or religious roles fit his framework, or the missing empirical support for his theory. Then there's also the general Orientalism for non-Western religions, and his connection to the Iron Guard, a Romanian fascist group, so... That was easy. Thanks, past me. Oh shit, Pearson was right. Where I've been was useful to past me's future me. This changes everything. This changes nothing. Quote, the most fundamental stories of the West are to be found, for better or worse, in the biblical corpus. For better or worse, Peterson? That's the most intriguing thing you said this chapter. Forget all the map stuff, expand on that. God creates, quote, habitable order out of the formless water void. And then there's the tohu bohu discussion we saw in Roll 10 of the last book, the seemingly unattainable speech precision chapter, this time folding in Tiamat and the Enuma Elish. Jungian blah blah about the symbolic potential of the oceanic abyss, the quote, fire-breathing tree, cat, snake, bird, dragon, lurking out in the chaos forest, Leviathan. When I say he conceptualizes order as a city we live in, surrounded by the chaos forest, I'm not unfairly summarizing. It's what he says. Taking a massive hit off the Jungian Rig, quote, God has an attribute, or an alternative person, or a faculty, or a tool that aids him, or that he relies on when confronting possibility and the void. Oh, for sure, man, for sure. He is all of whatever you just said. The symbolic multi-tool is the word, but also speech ability, because he quickly spoke us into existence and declared us good and necessarily responsible having been made in his image. You might want to slow down. Pump the brakes, brah. You're losing reality a bit. But it's not just speech, it's truthful speech, and the principle of love for being itself. Combine that with truth and courage, and you get the ideal, which makes the best future, because we do know and believe in the good and evil paths, and things we bring into being are good as long as we try to do good. Believing and acting this out is the fundamental act of faith. I'm not kidding, bro. Let's get you some air. Maybe some water? You must capital A, ask, the metaphorical but quite possibly also literal New Testament God for what you wish, but to do that you need to first do the prep work so that your wish is worthy. Bro? Your inner possibility is waiting for the outer teacher for release, but you're lying to yourself, which means you'll lie to yourself more and more and more and more. I knew this was a bad idea. This is just like last time when you started ranting about those chaos forest tigers who are also dragons that you couldn't fight as a mouse rabbit. Just stay with me. Take some breaths. So you're weaker and not living up to your potential because of those lies. And you're more likely to lie and the problem's getting bigger. I must repent and ask and knock and seek. Otherwise it'll get worse. Peterson? You're spiraling. It's our destiny to transform chaos into order. But if the past isn't ordered, the present's chaos, and part of our Jungian selves are torturing us to update our map by seeing how we made ourselves a victim, so we need to burn the old map and ourselves so we were to become who we could be, and that will protect us. If old memories still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. Are you done? Seriously though, if we get past the style mad wrapping paper, and box, and tissue paper, there's a lot in the way here. If we set all that aside, this last section is very reminiscent of the original 12 rules, Rule 10. Be precise in your speech. Precise speech narrows down the bad thing that did happen from those that did not. Weird metaphor about the importance of checking out the real bad thing so you will stop imagining worse bad things. And the real bad thing might be, quote, something truly terrible, but it's important to check so you can properly confront it. If you don't confront it, the problem will grow to Tiamat levels of confusion and suffering. Quote, be careful with what you tell yourself and others about what you have done, what you are doing, and where you are going. You can make sense of and benefit from the past if you clearly state what happened, then map out your future. This is how you use the word to make order. Clear speech prevents problems from festering in the darkness. Then there's this early version of his map metaphor of needing to know where you've been to know your location now and how to get to the next point. You must have clear aim to get to the next point. Quote, confront the chaos of being. Set your goal, specify your next point, and set off with your precise speech. Just swap out the imprecise speech for the upsetting old memories and it's roughly the same thing. Conclusion. As I said earlier, this is a prime Peterson problem chapter. The big picture advice is fine, but there's issues with the details. Old memories still upsetting you almost certainly indicates there's more processing you need to do with those memories, especially if we're talking trauma levels of upset. Some people are able to fly this process solo and writing these memories down carefully and completely may be part of the healing process for them, but so could any other number of meditative acts. But other people, quite possibly a lot of people, will need help detangling these old memories. Quite possibly professional help if we are talking about traumatic memories. That's a major problem for this chapter. Upsetting encompasses a bit of a spectrum in this context. Could be relatively minor stuff your brain lobs at you Akira style, all the way to full PTSD responses. The appropriateness of this advice along this spectrum isn't touched on. Perhaps even worse, all the examples were clients who saw him in his clinical psychologist capacity. A quick reminder that in my psych discipline organizing tree, I put both clinical and counseling psych on the squishy branch. But counseling psychology tends to focus more on the normal day-to-day problems, and clinical psychology's focus is more severe psychological disorders. Peterson was seeing these clients as a clinical psychologist. As he described in this chapter, their problems were on the more severe end of things. The reader is expected to take the part of these stories, the moral that Peterson wants them to, while setting aside the outright traumatic aspects of each story, seeing themselves in those stories and mirroring some other alternative that I'm not seeing. One of my concerns here is something akin to the seductive detail effect and kinda related to the weapon focus effect. The weapon focus effect being that when a weapon is present in a scene, memory for other details besides the weapon drops, which makes sense because your attention has a reason to be focused on that weapon. And the seductive detail effect means that you have a core piece of information and all of the stuff surrounding it, like pictures, graphs, weird music, just all of the stuff that you're using to try to get people to pay attention can reduce the memory for that core piece of info. There is a lot of nuance in the research for both of those that we are now going to neglect in an attempt to wrap up this video as efficiently as I can at this point. So the concern is that Peterson has set up the reader to not be able to extract the core point from these stories because of those extraneous, vivid details. And I'm left wondering why he chose these particular client stories to share. I mean, it's probably because he felt these represented the core advice of addressing the upsetting memory carefully and completely and moving on, but something about this isn't squaring for me. So let's quickly retrace our steps. First section is setting up how it doesn't matter if you did bad or had bad done to you, the memory emotional systems don't care. They just don't want it happening again. If you don't learn from the past, those systems will make you repeat the horror endlessly. At least until you're able to understand what happened. Presumably, once you reach sufficient understanding, those emotional memory systems will leave you be. Too bad these emotional memory systems don't abide by Peterson's clear-cut programming. As an example, I've picked up some trauma in my dealings with the medical system. I understand why the doctors were treating me the way they were, and I understand where my emotional and physical responses were coming from. It doesn't change the reality that I can be flung back into traumatic reactions to this day when doctors, particularly new doctors, brush up against those old triggers. The second section's client was rapidly able to leave behind a traumatic childhood incident because Peterson recontextualized the memory from an adult perspective. Section 3's client was eventually able to fix his sleep problems after a sketchy hypnosis session with Peterson that purportedly forced him to, quote, face the reality of his own experience as well as the nature of the world and stop being so naive, and also process the look on his ex's face and how he felt in response. The last client started recovering from his psychotic episode after doing Peterson's self-authoring program and getting some coaching on how to handle bullies in the future and better reach out for help, as well as psychiatric medication. Boiling it down this far, it seems like the core chapter advice is only part of the story for each of them. Client 1 had to get Peterson's perspective for the shift. Client 2 had a lengthy road to recovery with what seems like a lot of outside context Peterson didn't share. While Client 3 did write down the upsetting memory carefully and completely, it sounds like it was equally important that he learned coping skills. So, I guess my fundamental problem is the rule advice would have been insufficient to help these clients, even if we branch out into all the unknown chaos tigers being kept at bay by our order words of the last section. This leaves us with my edited version of this advice. If old memories still upset you, poke at them a bit. Are they relatively mild, run-of-the-mill cringe moments? Don't worry about extracting the moral of it or whatever. We're all human and will sometimes be the cringe inducer. Something to try here does come from PTSD research. So when one of these cringe memories hit you, instead of focusing on the discomfort and reflexively trying to shove it away, let it sit for a minute and try to focus on other aspects of the scene. Who was with you? Where were you? What was the weather like? Was there music? Just put your attention elsewhere. So when you are remembering something, the memory trace file, whatever metaphor you want to work with, doesn't have restricted access. You have full read-write access. New information is going to be encoded every time you remember it. So by focusing on those more neutral parts of the scene, over time, this memory will lose the intense negative visceral feeling and just be a kind of bleh thing that happened. But don't expect this process to happen right away, which is another problem with Peterson's framing. It'd be cool for you if it does happen just that quick, but odds are it's going to take a little bit of time at least. But it's possible these memories are on the more severe end, and by all means, try to tackle it yourself. Try doing yourself a narrative exposure tool past authoring exercise. Break your life into roughly 7 chunks, and for each chunk identify the major events, both positive and negative. With all of those identified, write a narrative of your life, a little autobiography, where you incorporate those different events and the lessons you've learned, the impact they have on who you are now. This process might help alleviate some of the weight of those memories, but it might not. There is no shame in reaching out for help. Maybe you have someone in your life who is a good listener and able to handle some of the heavier things. Maybe it's time to talk to a professional. Either way, you don't have to carry the weight of these memories alone. And life sucks, so if a new traumatic event happens, there's a couple things you can do to try to prevent the odds of a neural fear loop forming. So one is engaging in an intense visuospatial task. Tetris tends to be the go-to, but other things where you really have to use your vision, spatial manipulation of stuff will tie up a lot of the systems, and also try to not have good sleep. Sleep is when memory consolidation happens, so memories get laid down for long-term storage. So if you prevent that from happening, you reduce the odds of that memory getting laid down in a solid manner for later recall. Also, if you need, seek professional help. Those two things are very time sensitive. We're talking like inside the first 24 or 48 hours, so do what you can and then get help. Finally, to me, importantly, don't feel like you have to repent about these things. While I agree with Peterson that it's important to understand the factors, especially the ones that were in your control, that led to you ending up in whatever that negative situation was, but I strongly disagree with the framing that you had to have committed some errors to have ended up there. Bad things don't only happen because you fucked up. It's childish to think it works that way. And even if you made a mistake, beating yourself up for someone else taking advantage of that is counterproductive, and expecting this to be part of the healing process is bullshit. Right. That was that chapter. Up next, we've got Rule 10. Plan and work diligently to maintain the romance in your relationship. And if you've made it this far into the video, I'm sure it won't surprise you that it's from a incredibly compulsive heterosexual marriage and babies perspective. Till next time. Bye. No. So sad. Try to show everything off. Not my first rodeo, but